Recording is started.
All right. So hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Emily Bovier, and I am the chair of the psychology department. I'm also the new accessibility fellow coordinator for 2024. I'm a former accessibility fellow, which is essentially how I got into this line of work. So today I'm going to be talking to you about how to support neurodiverse students. And I've given various versions of this talk. So some of you might be at this talk for the first time. Some of you might have attended some of my talks in the past. There's new stuff, there's old stuff. So I have some resources to share with everyone. I'm going to put a link to my slides in the chat for anyone who wants to follow along, and also just to make sure that everyone has access to the slides, because there are some additional resources that you can link to. So I'll share this again at the end, just in case anyone jumps in late and wants access to the slides. So I'm going to go ahead and let's see, share my screen here. And then we can go ahead and get started. Just so everybody knows, I am very happy to have this be an interactive session. So you are more than welcome to jump in, ask questions, give some of your insight. I might not be able to see everyone on my screen. So if a hand is raised, I might miss you. So you can go ahead and just unmute yourself. Or if Maggie, if you're able to monitor the chat, you can sort of chime in if there's some points in the chat that come up as well. Perfect. Thank you. All right, so today we're going to talk about supporting neurodiverse students, and the two main objectives are to explore what is known as invisible disabilities. And so these are essentially disabilities that are not necessarily visible, and they fall under the umbrella of neurodiversity. So we'll spend some time just giving an overview of what those invisible disabilities might quote unquote look like. And then we'll take some time to reflect on our current classroom practices, or if you're a staff member, just some of the practices that you work with students, and brainstorm plans for any modifications that we might need to make to ensure that we are supporting and including our neurodiverse students. So in general, this term of neurodiversity, it's becoming much more well-known over the last few years. Essentially, when we are talking about our students at SUNY Oswego, we're talking about students with invisible disabilities. Two of the more well-known conditions that fall under this blanket of neurodiversity are autism spectrum disorders and attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder. There is also some language in the field now that's considering anxiety and mood disorders as falling under that blanket of neurodiversity. So this includes things like generalized anxiety disorder, depression, bipolar disorder. And then you have other conditions that are more traditionally known as disabilities, quote unquote, and that's any learning differences or intellectual disabilities. So the goal for this session is not to have a clinical approach, but rather to adapt a strengths-based model for understanding our neurodiverse students to help set them up for success by focusing on their individual differences as assets and really trying to capitalize on their strengths. So I teach a class on neurodiversity, and in addition to just understanding neurological and psychological differences in how our brains function, I do adopt this strengths-based model so that students can understand how we can focus on the strengths of individuals who might be considered neurodiverse. A couple of other just notes as I talk through here. So I may refer to a student with autism or an autistic student. I'm going to flip back and forth between the language unless I'm talking about someone specifically who has identified how they prefer to be identified. So you can either have a person-centered approach or a label-centered approach, if you will, and it's an individual choice. So my brother, for example, has autism, and he does not prefer one way or the other. Sometimes he refers to himself as autistic. Sometimes he refers to himself as a person with autism. So if you hear me flip-flopping back and forth, just know that it's because there are differences depending on what people prefer. And unless I'm talking about someone specifically, the way I talk about it does not mean anything one way or the other. All right, so I would just like to share some resources that I was able to obtain from a talk last semester. So this is a community that focuses on neuroscience. And this particular lecture, which I have linked here if you'd like to view the whole thing, it was really eye-opening for me. And so this talk was on understanding the supports and value of diverse learning in the classroom through the lens of neurodiversity. It's an incredibly helpful talk. I've taken some information from that and embedded it here today. One thing that stood out to me in terms of how we characterize neurodiversity and how we're trying to break free from, there are various models of disability, right? So there's a medical model of disability, there's a social model of disability. A medical model of disability tends to fall in line with this first half of this figure here that looks at something like autism or ADHD as a disorder, right? And the goal here is to flip the paradigm and think about it more from a social model of disability and understanding how environmental and social constructs are what disable a person as opposed to the underlying condition itself. So this visual was very helpful for me. If you think of something like autism from a disorder paradigm, it views autism as a brain dysfunction, right? With interventions that are targeted specifically on either the direct brain dysfunction itself or some of the behaviors that result from that quote unquote brain dysfunction. But what we know is that neurodiversity is simply just that. It's an individual difference in cognition, in behavior, in the way our brains operate. So we can consider all of us on a continuum with various constructs, right? Attention, sensory processing, memory, our degree of social engagement, things like that. And this neurodiversity paradigm flips it from a disorder paradigm and considers the idea that we all have individual differences in our brain. So someone with autism may be atypical. If you think about a normal distribution, a bell curve, they might fall on the ends of a distribution, but that is normal variation. So the idea here is that there's just differences. It's not abnormal, it's just a difference in how we think, how we do, how we are. And the idea here is that the intervention should be targeting not necessarily changing those behaviors, but thinking about how we can affirm experiences of neurodiverse individuals depending on the context. So we want to focus on things like what we want to target is, does that person feel accepted? Do they have a sense of agency? How resilient are they? Do they feel valued? Do they have a sense of belonging? So those are the targets of an intervention. We want to target those environmental circumstances that might lead to someone feeling not accepted or not have a sense of agency. And so we can focus on that aspect when we are targeting a quote unquote intervention for someone who is neurodiverse. So I take this model and I think about how I can translate that into my role as an educator and thinking about how I can best support neurodiverse students in a classroom setting. And again, for anyone who is interested, I shared the slides in the chat. I'll do so again here in a little bit so that everyone has access to it. And this is the link to the talk by Dr. Caroline Richter that included this paradigm. All right, so I'm going to ask you all to think and reflect on some aspects here. They are very much geared towards the classroom. That's my primary role, but if you are not in the classroom, you can still take these pieces and think about how you can implement them with what you do. So throughout the talk today, we'll have an opportunity to consider our course policies, such as our attendance policies, our participation policies, use of technology in the classroom, how we use inclusivity statements. All of that is important to consider if we want to support our neurodiverse students. We can also consider learning assessments. So if you think about the way in which you quantify learning in your class, consider whether you have alternative forms for assignments or exams, flexibility in due dates, things like that. And also the physical environment is important to consider. Admittedly, we likely have less control over the physical environment, but we can keep in mind how that might impact someone. So this includes things like the lighting, the acoustics in the room, and the physical layout of the space. So I know we haven't talked specifically about neurodiverse students quite yet in terms of some of the challenges that they may face. But what I'd like you to do is just take 2 minutes and think about what components of your current pedagogy might benefit from further development to ensure equity and inclusion for neurodiverse students. So think about your course policies. What do those look like? What are your assessments look like? And how about your physical environment? And then after about 2 minutes, I'll give you all some time to think. And then we can start working our way through each of these things in the context of specific neurodiverse conditions. And I'm just going to pop my slides into the chat again for anyone who missed that initial chat. All right, so I'm going to move forward here. So keep some of your reflections in the back of your mind, and we'll have an opportunity to sort of talk things through. And as I said, you can jump in at any time with thoughts that you may have. So before I get into talking about specific neurodiverse conditions, I just wanted to share a student testimonial for you that will prime you with one example of how a classroom policy or something like that might impact a student. So this is from a student of mine who identified as autistic, and I was soliciting input from students about how things like attention, memory, and sensory overload might impact their experience in the classroom. And so this particular student says that my sensory overload occurs mainly when there's loud stimuli I don't like. Music is a good example of sensory stimulation I like, but large crowds, speaking, or ambivalent or ambient shuffling in a classroom are things that I regularly disengage from. Music itself can override a lot of the smaller, more consistent and irritating noises by keeping things on an overall volume level with my professor, which is why I typically opt to put in AirPods during class. So the reason why I bring this up is because I've had conversations with some folks who do not allow headphones in their classroom. And so I always raise this point is that, and something I think that I talk about with my students is, are you using it as a tool or are you using it as a toy, right? And so this student is using earbuds as a tool. By having music on at a certain level, the student is still able to engage with the class because the music drowns out the distracting ambient shuffling in the classroom and allows that student to focus on the professor. So when I asked you to reflect on your classroom policies, sometimes it's even something as small as this, right? Like the environment that you, the tone and the environment that you set at the beginning of the semester, like as whether or not students are allowed to use earbuds in class. Okay, so that's an eye-opening thing to think about as we move forward. All right, so we're going to start talking through autism spectrum disorders and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. And this is where, we'll have an opportunity to talk through our reflections at the end. But in case we do run out of time, you are more than welcome to jump in and share some of your thoughts about your classroom policies, your learning assessments, or your physical environment. And we can sort of talk through and troubleshoot how that might apply to a student who has autism. Okay, so please feel free to share. I will share from some of my experiences. And I think conversations like this are really helpful because this is something that Lynn and I have always talked about. If you meet an autistic individual, you've met one autistic individual. So sharing these experiences and getting student testimonials just helps sort of broaden our horizons even more. So in terms of characteristics of a student who has autism that might impact their academic performance, I have some things here. Just on a little side note, if we think about student success, obviously we think about academic performance, but this is just one piece of student success. For a student to be successful, there are many components that feed into it, like their ability to live independently, their degree of sense of belonging and social connection. So I'm highlighting academic performance in this talk, but just know that this is one piece of the puzzle. So in terms of, and this is from a research article in 2015 that actually solicited this information from neurodiverse students. So this is directly from students themselves. They find that they have challenges with neurotypical social communications and interaction. So think about if you use group work in your classes and how group work is used in your classes. Sensory reactivity. So again, this relates more to the physical space in the classroom. Hypersensitivity to change. So individuals with autism are very grounded by their routines. And so if routines are disrupted, that can lead to distress. So if due dates are changed or major guidelines of an assignment are changed, that can lead to distress. And notice here that I'm saying impact academic performance, and some of these are strengths-based, right? So that individuals with autism have very strong memory, incredible focus and precision, and analytical skills. And so depending on the nature of the class, you might see that they have some assets that will really come into focus depending on the nature of the assignment. Exhausting but necessary social contacts. So this sort of aligns with the challenges with neurotypical social communication and interaction. Again, think about group work in your class, whether it's in-class group work or if you require students to do group work outside of class. In terms of processing information, people with autism might have difficulty processing multiple forms of information and managing time. But they are able to, with proper structure and support and organization, do quite well. These last 2 points have to do more with overarching mental health related issues such as stress, anxiety, and depression. And many times autisms with individuals do what's called masking. Okay, so I've talked with this about with my brother, I've talked with this with students. Essentially, what they do is they mask some of their behaviors that might not be deemed quote unquote normal. This can include things like distress that they feel with social interactions or having to do things like maintain eye contact to demonstrate to a neurotypical person that they are engaged, because that is a signal to a neurotypical person of engagement. Yet to someone with autism, they can be perfectly engaged, but not maintaining eye contact. So having to direct attention to a behavior like that to demonstrate to a neurotypical person that they're engaged actually directs some of their attention away from the engagement of the topic at hand. Okay, so those are some things that we want to consider. Masking can have a significant effect on a person's mental health because the more energy spent masking the behavior can ultimately lead to what's called autism burnout. And this can range from, needing time to introvert to sort of recharge their battery to more extreme examples that might mirror something like depression, where the person is no longer able to care for themselves because they have essentially drained their batteries. So these are all things that we want to keep in mind in terms of how a student might be impacted by some of these characteristics in terms of the classroom. And I'm sure we can all reflect on how that can also impact other aspects of their lives that might contribute to their overall success here at SUNY Oswego. So does anyone have any input or pieces of information that they'd like to share in terms of understanding what students might face, experiences that they've heard from students, or if you yourself identify as a neurodiverse individual and want to share.
Can I ask a question, Emily?
Sure, go ahead, Amy.
I think I know what you mean by exhausting but necessary social contacts, but could you just kind of rephrase that some way? I'm not sure I have the right meaning there.
Absolutely. So if we think about socialization, and I'm going to step aside from academics here and use a more, universal experience to people. So think about like the holidays, right? The holidays typically involve a lot more interaction. You're sitting at the table with more people, you're hosting guests, things like that. That social contact, right? That social engagement can be truly exhausting. And we can think about it from just a typical introvert extrovert perspective, right? So introverts recharge their batteries by being alone. Extroverts recharge their batteries by being with other people, right? Really big picture, superficial way to think about it. So that and applied to autism, right? Like those social contacts or that social engagement might be different from their typical routine, or it might be that they are engaging with neurotypical people in the classroom, let's say, and have to mask in some capacity. And so it's necessary, right? We are social creatures, right? Even this right now is a social engagement. So it's necessary social engagement, but it can be exhausting. And more so for someone with autism, above and beyond what we would typically see for someone who may be introverted, let's say, and needs to have that extra time to sort of recharge from a social contact because of things like having to navigate an environment designed for neurotypical people and engaging in social expectations from neurotypical people. I had a student of mine do a reflection and basically it's difficult. The student said that every day is a challenge. And every day it's difficult to get a win. You never feel like you get a win, even in something so simple as a brief interaction with your professor or a peer. And it's heartbreaking to think about that these barriers can be overcome by how we construct our environments. And by that, I don't just mean physical environments, but creating an inclusive and welcoming environment and understanding that we have individual differences in terms of our attention, cognition, social interaction, and so on. So I hope that helped answer the question about the idea that we have social interactions that are necessary, but they can be incredibly draining. So I can speak a lot about mental health issues and the consequence of masking just from my personal experiences with a family member with autism. And the social aspect, I've learned a lot from students. The sensory reactivity, I've learned a lot from my students in terms of distracting sensory information, how that can detract from attention. And one thing that I'm really looking forward to learning more about is the role of attention. I think attention is at the heart of all of this, right? And how our attention can be divided and the way that individuals who are neurodiverse might have differences in their ability to attend, and then the consequences that it can have. All right, so let's talk about some support recommendations for individuals on the autism spectrum. A personalized approach with student involvement is very important. So as I said, we can apply these overarching themes with broad characteristics in mind about how what might be a strength-based approach for individuals with autism. But again, they're individuals, right? So it's important to think about how, and that student should be involved in that personalized approach. The environment should be safe and transparent with sufficient planning and clear communication. Obviously, academic accommodations if they are needed, adequate psychosocial support. And so what the research has shown in talking about this with students who are neurodiverse, especially students with autism, is that they want social support, but those social support groups should be for just exchanging the experiences that they've had as neurodiverse individuals, not necessarily social support groups on how to best, quote unquote, fit in with a neurotypical world, right? So I just want to be very clear about that because there are, from a clinical perspective, psychosocial interventions that help people navigate different social environments in a neurotypical way. And that's not what we mean here by social support for individuals with autism. We want to make sure that they have leisure activities and a sufficient amount of rest. Again, so this sort of highlights the fact that in order to support a student's success in academics, yes, we have classroom policies that we can consider, which I will always advocate for universal design for learning. There are several other sessions throughout the workshops during this breakout that absolutely align with supporting students who are neurodiverse. And I'm hoping that this talk just gives you a new lens to look at those things, right? So if you are able to attend a talk on universal design for learning, if this information is new to you, hopefully that gives you a different lens to look at the different principles of universal design for learning and how that can support not only all students, but specifically students who are neurodiverse. All right, so before we get to attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, does anyone have any questions or input on autism? Lynn, I see your hand up.
Yeah, just a comment because my son has autism, which many of you already know about, but one thing to keep in mind, which I know, Emily, you already know, is we can't ask students if they have a specific issue, right? And based on my experience, and I'm sure for some of you as well, for Emily, we can usually tell a student who has autism, and I've sometimes been able to ask them certain questions and suggest perhaps that they get support or that they talk to somebody in accessibility resources or whatever. But I think the best thing really is to talk with that student individually. I know what's helped for my son specifically is he typically goes to his professors. He's in graduate school now, actually studying autism. And he goes to his professors at the beginning of every semester and says, I have autism. This is what it means. This is what I need. These are the accommodations I have. This is what I'm going to be doing in the classroom. This is what I need from them. And that's something that we've been able to help him with. But I totally appreciate your perspective on, getting the student involved and figuring out what's best for that student, but also recognizing that some accommodations are not going to work, right?
Absolutely. Yep.
So you have to really, and making those expectations very clear, like, yes, I understand that you have to stretch your legs every 5 minutes and walk out of the classroom, but that's just not really feasible. You can't do that, right? So let's see if we can work on a compromise and you have to be really clear for them because they don't often understand subtleties or some of those other things. So, but thank you for all this great information.
Yeah, absolutely. And so the other thing to point out is that I can imagine that as an instructor, it can feel very intimidating to, like Lynn has said, like Lynn and I have enough experience that sometimes it is easy to identify a student. But, let's say you're an instructor who teaches 200 students at one time. How do you reach all of those students? And that's where I will continue to advocate things for like inclusive practices and universal design for learning, where you can be proactive and the policies that you put into place are meant to support students so that they do not have to disclose, so that they do not have to seek out specific accommodations, because many students might not be diagnosed yet, right? And that's a whole other topic to discuss about the process of being able to receive a diagnosis to get the proper accommodations and get the proper support. So another thing that I want you to think about in terms of the reflection questions that I had is how can we make changes to our course policies to best support students with the knowledge of some of the barriers that neurodiverse students might face, and then making it an equitable experience for everyone.
Amy,
yep, I see it. I saw a raised hand from Amy. Go ahead, Amy.
Well, you kind of addressed it, which is how do you deal with so many students that seem to maybe never have been diagnosed? They didn't have the resources in K through 12. Their parents maybe weren't educated to recognize things, and they don't know. They just know that they're frustrated.
Sure.
You can't really say to them, I think you need to go get a diagnosis, right? So
sure.
I'm just you said that's a whole other thing. So maybe that's why I took my hand down, is that maybe that's just another.
No, that's a great question though. So the one piece that we can talk about is what can we do as instructors from the get-go so that students do not have to disclose? How can we best design our courses, design our experiences so that there's universal support for students? So that's the piece that I can focus on today. But then the question also becomes, maybe there's additional help that a student might need. And so I see no problem with reaching out to a student to discuss how they're doing, and then just to offer up more broadly things like mental health support services. You don't necessarily have to disclose to them that you think they might be experiencing characteristics of autism or ADHD. Usually the students are pretty self-aware and they will disclose that they think that they have it. But you're right, there might be some students that are not aware and they don't have those resources and they're just frustrated. And so that's where you can just extend the opportunity to connect with someone in mental health counseling or advising and go from there. But that is, and then I think like if we form a community here on campus of like-minded individuals, like everyone here, to just troubleshoot with each other and say like, what do I do? How do I help this student? And by forming that community, it'll help with dealing with those unique individual circumstances. But I think it's a relevant question for this because we can't ignore that side of it. Even if that's not necessarily the main focus here, it's still very much a part of it. So that's a good question. All right, so since we've been talking about this with autism spectrum disorders, let's see here, I'm going to look at my time. I'm going to talk about attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and then we can get into some more of those reflection components where we can think through our course policies and our assessments and our physical environments, keeping both of these aspects in mind. So students with attention deficit and hyperactivity disorder, following the same model that we had for understanding autism, let's look at some characteristics that impact academic performance. So typically, and again, these are reported by students themselves, procrastination, lack of concentration, ineffective self-regulation, poor planning, anxiety, social challenges, and time management. So these are all things that even independent of someone identifying as neurodiverse, that our students may struggle with, right? So when we adopt inclusive practices and universal design for learning, not only are we supporting students who are neurodiverse, but again, this is a continuum and there's individual differences. And so you may have many students who are not neurodiverse who lack concentration or have ineffective self-regulation. So the idea here is to think about our practices and how we can target some of these characteristics that might impact academic performance. In terms of ADHD itself, from just the blanket understanding that there are attentional challenges and then there are hyperactivity components to it. But the research suggests that it's inattention as opposed to hyperactivity that's going to be associated with outcomes that include things like academic adjustment, the ability to make decisions regarding long-term careers, study skills, and things like that. So again, I think attention is at the root of this. And we can think about how to design our courses to promote a more strengths-based approach and help students overcome some of the barriers that they might be experiencing. So let's talk about some support recommendations for ADHD. I have, again, some links for all of you here throughout the talk. If you think about coaching, and these are things that we can consider not only, these are more like broader initiatives that we can consider as a university in terms of mentoring students, but cognitive, behavioral, and psychoeducational approaches are very helpful for changing both negative outcomes. So whether we see behavioral, emotional, or cognitive outcomes, or just beliefs. So students who, as Amy mentioned, like students are frustrated, right? The neurotypical environment that neurodiverse individuals find themselves in can be very frustrating. And so that can lead to a lot of low self-esteem and negative self-beliefs. And so you can use cognitive behavioral principles to help people understand behavioral outcomes and then self-beliefs or schemas that they hold about themselves. These include things like creating schedules, setting weekly goals, helping students prioritize. Rewards and consequences are helpful to focus on executive functioning, emotional regulation, inhibition, organization, and problem solving. So for those of you that are interested in learning more about that, I have a link to a resource that people have used for coaching individuals who have ADHD. And let's talk just briefly about anxiety and mood disorders, because again, I want to prime everyone with the idea that we have what are well-known neurodiverse conditions, but anxiety and mood disorders are also starting to fall under this umbrella of neurodiversity. And again, that's generalized anxiety disorder, depression, and bipolar disorder. The main important points to consider here is that, and similar, this applies to autism and ADHD as well, is that individuals might, with these challenges that they face, have maladaptive coping and feelings of shame, right? So there's that stigma that's associated with these conditions, or just the frustrations that a person experiences when they're faced with these societal environmental structures. So it's also important to consider the role of intersectionality in terms of understanding these mental health disorders. So again, a neurodiverse status, whether you identify as neurodiverse or neurotypical, does not occur in isolation. So we have to consider the effects of race, ethnicity, past trauma, gender, sexual orientation. There are many aspects that intersect with neurodiversity. So as I mentioned, I am a big advocate for applying principles of universal design for learning. There are talks on UDL throughout this breakout session. On my slides, this is just a reference for all of you. I'm just going to click over to it. These are the main principles of universal design for learning. So I don't want to focus too much on this right now, because I want to give opportunity for people to ask questions and share some of their insight as well. But so I'll spend a couple of minutes on this so that we have about 10 minutes left for discussion. The main principles of universal design for learning think about providing multiple means of engagement, representation, and action and expression. And so this can be a guiding principle for how you design your courses or experiences for students. And so if you think back to those original reflection questions of, what are my classroom policies? Are there multiple means or opportunities for engagement? Do you represent information in multiple ways? And do you provide multiple means of action and expression? So these are guiding principles that will be useful for all students. But again, if you're looking at this for the first time through the lens of neurodiversity, hopefully this talk has helped conceptualize what it's like for individuals who identify as neurodiverse, and how we can ensure that we are designing experiences for students in a way that allows for a strengths-based approach. So that not only are we removing barriers, but we're providing opportunities for them to excel and really focusing on their areas of strengths. So I have some other information here, a case study that you can use on your own to think about, what you might do in that situation. But what I'd like to do is spend some time thinking on this first reflection question, specifically for autism spectrum disorders. So at the beginning of the talk, I primed you to think about your different practices. And I'd like to hear from folks just about some of their thoughts. What approaches do you use that might present challenges for students with autism spectrum? And what approaches do you use that might promote strengths? So Ramin, I saw a hand pop up right away. Go ahead.
One of the reasons I wanted to come to this one, even though I was having trouble finding time to do it, but I felt I had to.
I appreciate you being here.
I lost one of my students this past semester who I thought was going to do well, but the more collaborative activities I included, where you're trying to come up with creative solutions as groups of 3 or 4, the more he kind of quietly stepped away from the course. And I felt really bad about it, but at the same time, an awful lot of students thrived from that experience by, you have an idea, I give you a possible path from that idea to a better one, and back and forth. And I think we want that, yet
Sure.
I did lose him because of the fact that he wasn't really able to engage that way comfortably. So, I just stopped coming to class, whatever. So I would like to do things differently. I just don't really have a tool for this, because coming up with creative solutions is messy. I mean, there's no obvious right way to do something. I mean, Amy's world is probably a good one when you're trying to make a film. But I'm doing a storytelling type of an exercise in a tool, in a system that allows people to come up with a way to tell one.
Yeah.
I don't care what the story is. You have to come up with
Sure.
it. And so that type of an interaction requires listening to someone and then bringing more ideas to the table. And boy, that just didn't work for this young man.
Yeah. So this is great. So that case study that I skipped over was essentially this. Like, you're in a situation where you have designed an experience for students that relies on collaboration with others. And unfortunately, like, my gut reaction is, yeah, that's really challenging. What do we do in that situation? Because you're right, like, regardless, there are fields that are more independent, but generally speaking in life, we will have to collaborate with others in some capacity. So that's an important skill to learn. It's an important part of the classroom experience, and other students thrive in that. So the solution is not removing that experience, right? It's how do we come up with an alternative experience so that the student is able to thrive in some capacity. It's the same thing with students who have challenges with public speaking, right? So independent of being neurodiverse, you're going to have students who are nervous with public speaking. And so the idea of a compassionate challenge from the last reading group, that resonated with me. And I'm very transparent with students about that I will have compassion for you and I will work with you, but I'm also going to challenge you. And so in that case, Ramin, I think the idea of trying to think about alternative ways to have a student engage, and we can absolutely open this up. Like, do people have thoughts on how could we ensure that student remained engaged, but yet was afforded an opportunity to demonstrate their learning in a way that would still highlight their strengths? So if that individual was challenged by collaborative creative expression, how could they still submit something that met your learning outcome, right? And maybe they wouldn't succeed as much in the social interaction of it, but they didn't have to lose all of it. So I think I saw Amy, I think you have a hand up, go right ahead.
Yeah, I think Ramin was implying that it would be easier in the world of cinema studies. This is actually like our biggest collective challenge in our major. One of our core learning outcomes in the major is collaboration.
Right.
And so some of the things that I've done is, rather than having random selection, I try to have intentional grouping designs where I know some of the strengths of other students who are able to work more effectively with students who may have ASD, but may also just be extremely introverted, not be the born leader of the group, etc. I try to give protocols to groups that are new to collaboration, where I give them, okay, here's what you're going to do. You're going to assign one person and they're going to give this prompt, then this prompt, then this prompt. Everybody has to respond to the prompt. Nobody can repeat the same thing somebody else said. I give them time constraints. Max air time is 2 minutes. Sometimes when particularly in like lower level courses where I'm getting a lot of these students who have not had that skill set, I try to structure it. And then the other thing I do is I always give a parallel autonomous assignment to all group activity. It's not a gripe paper. That's what I tell them. You're not allowed to write gripes about your groups, but where they reflect on literally what did they do, what worked well for them in the group, what were their challenges, and if they had this all to do over again, what would they have done differently? So that it allows them to try to also kind of work through some of the anxieties, the challenges, and things like that. It's not a panacea at all, but it has helped a lot of my students get through the process.
I think that's great. And so, like, if you think about that particular example of being in a collaborative setting, if you think about how is that constructed, right? So is there an alternative form to it? Can you provide more structure to that collaborative experience that might help a student? I've done group work in the past where students take on certain roles. So if they're working on a reading, one is the creative connector, one is the discussion leader, one is a vocab person who has to highlight terminology that might be unfamiliar. And then those roles can rotate. And so having some structure like that might help. And maybe the student could find that they excel in one particular role. They might not be as strong in another role, but that's going to be the case for all students. They're going to excel in some areas and have some challenges in other areas. So I think thinking about how you can have alternative forms. The other thing that came to mind is if it's in real time, a collaborative experience, could you provide an opportunity for students to write down their thoughts and then assign a leader to the group who can then help that person with that interaction? Some people are better with not responding in real time, but having comments and being able to process it over time. So you could continue the group work through the learning management system. And then the person might be able to add more in that context, maybe not so in the group context, but the follow-up later. So that's what I mean when I say things like alternative forms or flexibility in your assignments or your group activities. John, I see your hand up.
Yeah, we have a number of people from other SUNY campuses here. Might it be possible to change the settings to make it viewable?
Yes, I saw that in the chat, and then I'm not very good at multitasking. So I'm going to change the parameters so that it's outside of SUNY Oswego and anyone with the link can view.
So save the link and it'll be available later.
Yep. So I'll send this at the end here, and I'll send the link back out, and then I'll change the sharing settings.
Thanks.
Any other thoughts that you have in the last few minutes that we're together here about your just reflecting on your policies, assessments, or physical environment?
Emily, I had a couple of thoughts on just building that connection early on in the class. So I think your neurodivergent students may have a hard time connecting with their peers. So giving them opportunity to really learn people's names, because that might not be something that comes naturally, and they may not be comfortable approaching somebody that they don't know their name, or they just may not even see it because they're so focused on overcoming sensory challenges that they're just struggling to multitask in different ways that we can't see. So, one of the other sessions I had earlier was Kristen Croyle was talking about, building in that counting off or, creating the groups so that your neurodivergents aren't the last to always be picked, because that's hard for them when they're always the last to be picked. And then to give them some common ground, talk about one food that you like or you don't like, and just really simple things that they know they have one thing in common that they can start a conversation, because that's a challenging point for them to be able to have that. And I think if you could start to build some of those connections, then they would rely a little bit more on their peers. Once that overwhelmingness hits, it seems like it's very challenging, and it just gets worse and worse for them. So I think to see that, that they've got somebody that they're comfortable saying, I didn't understand what that means. Can you help me? A lot of times they feel stupid for having to ask when it's really not an intelligence thing. It's an overwhelming thing. It's a neurodivergence. So just
absolutely. And that can even be, like those practices are part of just how you set the tone in your classroom. Something as simple as providing an inclusivity statement on your syllabus, or being transparent about why you're doing an activity like that, to help students form those connections and to help them feel comfortable, and invite students in to collaborate on how they would like to construct their classroom environment and interactions with students. I think that's a really helpful point to think about how we can help bridge that gap for students so that they are not overwhelmed by doing it themselves, in terms of finding common ground with their peers to make them more comfortable in a situation so that they can more effectively engage in those collaborative group efforts when they are presented with a task in class.
Yep, and I think the syllabus too, 2 or 3 pages to the average student might not be much, but to have a neurodivergent student is not going to read it. It's too much, it's overwhelming. Break it down into, if you could chunk it into pieces and maybe add some visuals to go along with it, they're much more likely to probably look at those visuals than read through pages of text.
Absolutely. Yeah, chunking information is really important. One thing that I did with my class that I didn't realize, my neurodiverse student said that I had my assignments due at the start of class time. And that was just to give some students flexibility. Like if they needed the morning to do it, they could take the morning, but he did not like that. He's like, everyone else has it due at midnight. And so he relied on the due date at midnight, and mine was different. And so that really threw him off. And that just gave me some insights like, oh, wow, I thought I was doing this in a way to support students by giving them that extra time, but maybe I should have it due at midnight with the flexibility that you can have it due as late as the start of class time, right? So lots of different things to consider. And again, that might just be that individual person's preference, but there are lots of ways that students can be impacted by overwhelming information or different types of information or different policies across courses. So not only do we have our own course, but then we have to consider that our students are managing other courses that likely have different policies, different due times, different structure of syllabi. So the more we can standardize, organize, minimize overwhelming information, the more likely we are to set those students up for success. All right, so I think we're a little bit past time. So thank you so much for everyone for coming. I will change the sharing settings on the slides so that everyone is able to access them. And again, there's a few links throughout there for more information. Thanks, everyone.